Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the virtual edition of We Robot 2020, the premier international conference on law and policy relating to robotics, hosted this year by the University of Ottawa Centre for Law, Technology and Society. Reinvented in the times of COVID-19, We Robot 2020 is presented with the generous support of Microsoft, CIFAR, X, and Intel, as well as the University of Ottawa, the University of Washington Technology Policy Lab, and Miami Law. For those not familiar with the We Robot format, please note that authors do not present their own work. Instead, a session discussant reads the author's paper in advance of the conference and then presents the author's work to the audience, while offering constructive thoughts for improvement and seeding the conversation that follows. Authors will then have 5 minutes to respond to the discussant's feedback, and the session opens to the floor. For our virtual edition, we invite the audience to engage with the papers in the comment section below the video. For this session, we are delighted to welcome as our discussant Hugo Cyr from the Université de Québec à Montréal to present Towards Integration of African Priorities into Artificial Intelligence Policy Agendas, a paper by Arthur Gwagwa from Strathmore University, Erica Kramer-Mbula from the University of Johannesburg, Nagla Risk from the American University in Cairo, Isaac Ruttenberg from Strathmore University, and Jeremy De Beer from the University of Ottawa. A link to the paper is available underneath this video. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Hugo, and we're excited to hear your comments on this really interesting work.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for welcoming me and inviting me to present and discuss a very interesting and timely paper on African priorities in terms of policy making related to artificial intelligence. So basically, the paper starts off by acknowledging the importance of AI in terms of profound opportunities and also profound challenges that it will pose everywhere in the world, but specifically in Africa in terms of economic, social, cultural development. And basically, what this paper does is that it starts off with an explanation or a definition of what is meant for the paper in terms of AI, and it takes a very broad, general approach. It doesn't get into the more technical details about what counts as AI and what doesn't. It really takes into account a very ecumenical view in order to really assess the general challenges. So instead of just looking at one specific approach, it really takes into consideration all forms of AI or automated decision-making tools. So this is very important. Then it goes on to present its methodology. It's basically based on series of authors' approaches defining what are the main policy questions. So the paper relies on a survey of policy papers dealing with AI policy issues in order to present a general map of what are the main issues that are raised, discussed, and thought about in terms of policy decisions. Now, one point which is very important is that it really tries to focus on not only the general policy issues that are too frequently, and I say too frequently on purpose, discussed in the Western world, and the idea is to look at not only what is being said in the industrialized world, but also what is being said related to the African continent. The author recognized that oftentimes this is a a part of the discussion that is somehow forgotten, or there's not enough effort being put into thinking about how those issues will affect and should be how those issues will affect Africa, and how policy thinking should be used to help the healthy development of AI in Africa in order to help local development. So the two main issues that, well, there are a series of issues that are common to all policy frameworks that discuss AI, such as issues dealing with justice and equity, use of force, safety, privacy, taxation, and displacement of labor. There is also an issue of political self-determination that has to be that should come into play, and I'll come back to this point because I think the paper could do even more on this aspect. One of a lot of those issues that are presented, I would say, in a functional matter. That is, how can the tool affect the market, or how can the tools affect the industrial structure, how the tool can affect the distribution of wealth, and so on. There is, and I'll come back to this point, there is not much on the cultural aspect, or the issue of preservation of the diversity of culture. But that's not, as I said, that's not the crust of this paper. This paper is really about identifying a set of policy issues that, for the author, seems most pressing, and looking at the different models, different lists of issues that have been raised in scholarly papers and presentations. Basically, two issues become at the forefront of the reflection, and the selection of those two issues is specifically based on the specific realities on the ground in Africa. So the two issues that the authors decided to discuss more in depth are issues of AI and equity, and in large part issues dealing with gender. And the other one is dealing with AI and labor in African setting. So the authors do a very good job at describing the context in which AI may be deployed in Africa, in terms of explaining what kind of digital gap there is. So this is dealing with everyone in general, but also the specific digital gap that affects women in Africa. So they point to the difficulties there, but at the same time, they do a good job at explaining what opportunities that AI also raise. And they do a good job at explaining, for example, the role of women in startups, and to what extent they have a very important participation in such digital enterprises in Africa. And they actually, in some countries, they are the majority developers, and in many countries they are. There should be examples for the so-called industrial world in terms of women's participation in the development of startups. So this is what I like this part of the paper a lot, because it's not all gloom and doom. This is a very interesting aspect. There is a strength here, and it has to be highlighted and buttressed. So this is very interesting. So it basically looks at a different context. I like the fact that it presented specific industries in specific countries, the numbers there, and how women have integrated the sphere. And I think it's very useful to not only to talk in general terms, but have a specific case in mind. And maybe that would also have been a bit useful. In the paper, it presents where AI is being used, what kind of areas it's being used in Africa, but it would have been, I think, even more useful if those that come with specific cases. So instead of just talking about agricultural world, but just, for example, and give one use case, that would be useful. So overall, on the gender issue, it basically says, well, here are the challenges specific to the African continent. Here are the specific opportunities, and we should develop policies in order to enhance the role of women. And it gives the example of a series of examples of measures that have been taken in order to increase the participation of women, including specific coding courses that are available to women, and specific funding in order to help women to integrate this AI world. So this is very useful. Now, on the second major policy issue that they look at, they talk about the issue of labor in the African setting. We know that different forms of automatization have affected the labor market differently. In the past, automatization, sorry, for a francophone, this word is hard. What happened is there was a descaling of the workforce, meaning, for example, that artisans used to be very good at crafts and needed practice and experience and so on. And the industrial setting, what it did was that it basically cut in small chunks all the tasks that have to be done in order to automate them. And basically, it really affected the workers at the bottom of the pile in terms of taking their spot and automatizing these things. Now with AI, what we may witness in the industrial world is a upscaling. That is, a lot of the tasks that were situated in the middle management may be automatized now, and therefore there might be a gap that is growing in the middle between very high skilled workers and lower skilled localized workers. Now the paper highlights this possibility, but suggests that this phenomenon might hit Africa to a lesser extent because of the job structure. Also, one of the issues that is being raised in the Western industrialized world is that because of this movement from labor to capital, that is industries that used to employ a lot of workers to do a job, now move to a more capital intensive system where they need less workers to do and produce much more. There is a risk for the fiscal basis of a lot of countries, because the fiscal systems rely in a large part on taxation on wages. So if you have less workers doing the job and the profit comes from the capital itself and not from labor, then you might find yourself in a situation where the state has less revenues to ensure its functions. Now, the paper acknowledges this, but also says maybe the risk is not as high for Africa in terms of state funding, because the taxation system relies less on wages taxation, in part because of the informal economy, and in part because the state gets its revenues more from corporations directly. Now, I'll have a few comments or suggestions on this. I am not personally entirely convinced. I think you're right that the basis of taxation is not the same in Africa currently, but I'm not as optimistic in terms of future funding of the African states by corporations, and I'll explain why. Okay, so then after looking at those two specific areas, gender and labor, it basically looks at what are the developed world policy response, and looks at, surveys those responses in order to move towards a more targeted policy response that is adapted to the African continent context. So it doesn't say, well, it's not relevant for us. It says, well, there are things that are obviously relevant for us. The importance of inclusive development of AI, of growth, sustainable development, having a human-centered development, transparency, explainability, and so on. All the classic topics, those are important, but it recognizes that while those policy issues are being discussed and developed, oftentimes African representatives are absent from those discussions. They're not part of the loop. And it's a bit strange when we keep on talking about AI with human in the loop, but we talk about AI policies without having all humans in the loop. So this is a criticism that is forcefully made, and it gives an example of AI for humanity when the government of France in late 2019 convened a large series of people to discuss and think about AI and humanity policies, and without really integrating representatives of the African continent, and nor from Latin America or Asia, apart from Japan. So basically, this paper raises the issue that AI is not just a development that is happening in the industrial countries, but it affects the entire world, and we have to include everyone in the discussions. And also we have to be really careful in terms of developing policy responses that fit the realities on the ground of each region, because a solution that is being developed in the United States or Germany might not fit the realities in Mali or Morocco. So we have to also be sensitive to the social economic context and the cultural context. So basically, this paper is a call to the development of a Afrocentric AI policymaking, basically including by African, for African, and issues that are really closely connected to the realities. There is a significant set of opportunities there. There is also a significant set of challenges. And we can only address those if we really think through the specific context of Africa, looking at things on the ground, and they cannot, members of the African countries cannot be excluded. They have to be included within all the discussions that affects them. So that's the general, the gist of the paper. I have a few comments. Maybe the authors might not entirely agree with the way I presented things, and I'm sure they will be able to jump in and afterwards and correct me. I have basically 5 general comments. The first one is this is a very large topic, and and some of the comments I'm going to make shouldn't be seen as negative criticisms. They should be seen as constructive proposition, and I make them having in mind that discussing policy issues for an entire continent on AI covers so many aspects. So I'm going to tell you that you could have talked about this and that, and you can answer me, yes, we could. But we couldn't do it in a paper. We couldn't deal with all the issues. So, when we talk about AI policies, there are issues of industrial policies, cultural policies, economic policies, gender policies, and so on. So I recognize that you could not have taken on all fields of discussions. That being said, the first issue that I'd like to throw at you is that it's the issue of cultural diversity and having culturally sensitive development of AI. As you know, natural language processing requires a lot of data in order to train the systems. And for example, in order to train NLPs, what you do oftentimes is you scrape the internet for large chunks of text, and you feed those texts to your system in order to teach it. Now, Wikipedia is a wonderful source for training algorithms. Now, in English, you've got over 6 million articles that have been published. So this is a great data set. For Swahili, however, there's only a bit more than 40,000 articles. And there's 100 million people who speak Swahili. If you talk about Bananankan from Mali, there's about 15 million people speaking that language. It's the second most spoken language in Mali. Well, there's only, last time I checked, there were only 646 articles in Wikipedia in that language. So when comes the time to train your system, there is a huge issue coming from a data gap. And there's a risk that the training systems will include, because we all know that the biases or assumptions that are found in a data set will be represented in the outcome. There is a possibility, and it's not only a possibility, but it's a serious risk that the systems will be learning from a completely different culture, and the local culture and assumptions might not be represented in the tools that will be developed. And especially in terms of language, this is a major issue. Second, I would suggest well, I'd be more careful with 2 aspects of globalization, because some of the comments that have been made are, for example, on the impact of the changes in terms of the labor and the labor market. They seem to be assuming that the labor market and the commodities are really stuck in a closed market. But with globalization, there is a risk of dumping. So goods that have been produced even cheaper than with the labor locally could be dumped in the market. Now, I'll give you one last comment before, because I know that you need to also respond. One of the issues that could have been addressed is the risk of data colonialism, because one of the issues that you first raised was the importance of self-determination, and I think it's also linked to the NLP comment. It's the risk that the data that is being produced in Africa might not be produced by or for the local needs, but might be produced and sponsored in a sense by other countries. And it could be corporations from the United States, it could be corporations from China. We have seen, for example, deals that have been made between China and Zimbabwe for facial recognition purposes, the development of tools. So this is an issue of, is there a risk that former colonial structure reproduce themselves through the fact that other countries bring in the capital and they can exploit the situation, whereby the African countries only offer the natural resources or the basic resources, which are the data, but the actual work is being done outside of Africa. And this is something that really has to be thought about, how to develop locally the expertise in order to ensure that the work is being done in Africa for African. That's about it. I think I would have a series of other comments, but I'll let you respond. And thank you again for this very interesting paper and timely and important paper on this topic.
Thank you very much, Hugo, for such an interesting, presentation. It actually gave us a fresh perspective on the paper. I think I'm going to start on the comments that you raised at the end, because there could have been many issues that we could have included in the paper, but I think what we did was we started off with the Ryan Carlo framework, the issues that are covered under the Carlo framework, but there were many and so diverse. And we also realized that some of the issues were not very relevant to the African context. Then we ended up, comparing the Carlo framework with, the Matthew Smith and Norpan, framework, and made a decision that we should focus on future of work and gender. But we acknowledge that the issue of data and data colonization is very important, indeed very, very extremely important. But we thought that it was a minefield in its own right to be covered in a paper of such limited scope. So probably we believe that I think the issue of data can actually be covered in a separate paper altogether, because we do not really minimize the importance of data, because the issue of colonialism or colonization, I think, or reincarnation of colonization is based on that aspect. But I also acknowledge that the importance of cultural diversity. The issue of cultural diversity is very important and should have been covered in the paper. But what we did as well, I think when you look at the ecosystem of African researchers working on AI issues in Africa, the IDRC actually has another core where we have got researchers working on the issue of cultural diversity, natural language processing, So what we basically did was, to focus on areas that we are good at. Nagla looking at gender, Erica looking at future of work, and on my part, looking on other aspects, just maybe bringing all the aspects together. And the issue of political self-determination is also extremely important. But we also thought that is too contentious and too complicated to be covered in a paper of limited purview like the current one. But we acknowledge the criticism, and we believe that there are authors who are more qualified to look at that particular aspect than us. So I'm not sure whether I should continue with my comments or maybe let Erica jump in. Because there's an issue of globalization and labor that you have raised. So I'll let Erica comment to that and other issues before I chime in later. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Hugo, for a really good presentation of the paper and very important issues that you raised. I think it gives us as Arthur mentions, a fresh look on the paper, and also, it triggers thoughts about perhaps issues that we can connect in the conclusions of the paper, or perhaps issues that need, acknowledge them as issues that need further investigation in connection to the topics that we decided to focus on in this paper. So this is very important issues that you raised around the risk of data colonization and cultural diversity. In fact, is one of the I would say one of the negative impact that we need to consider is that the fact that we can fall into encoding perhaps discrimination in automated decisions. So basically creating algorithmic bias through artificial intelligence. And I think this is a very important aspect that we need to make sure that in the process of African countries embracing so-called 4IR technologies, one of them artificial intelligence, that we do not reproduce biases of data that has been collected in the past and decision-making that has been made in the past. So it is really a responsibility that we have within African countries to take this issue as a central as we move forward. In terms of the questions that you raised related in your presentation and also in the last comments related to the aspects that have to do with labor, just as contextualizing perhaps these comments, there are many sort of scary forecasts about the capacity of AI to displace labor very fast, and particularly in the context of Africa, affecting low-skilled labor specifically. And I think there are very good grounds to take into consideration these issues, as our advanced manufacturing is quite limited, and we have a predominance of low-skilled, low-paid, precarious jobs. So it is very important to take this into consideration, but there's also reasons to doubt fully these pessimistic views, and some of the estimations are perhaps not taking into account other dimensions that are very important to the labor market and to the productive fabric of African in the African context. So these ideas of being apocalyptic with the robots and technology displacing labor has been around for a very long time, and economists since the 50s have been talking about the potential for displacement of jobs, and I think this happened as well with the so-called third industrial revolution and the widespread of computing and so on, and jobs have been generated. The net effect in labor is very important. It's very difficult to predict, and I think we need to also take into account not only the specificities of the African labor and productive systems, but also their role, the unknown role of entrepreneurship in creating and generating work and the emergence of new industries. In the paper, we discussed a little bit the role of informality and you know, perhaps thinking a little bit with a more open mind about the resources that we have in terms of knowledge, labor, and creativity, and how those can be utilized in the context of AI in more efficient ways in an African context. And I think this is the point that we try to raise up. And you raise a very valid point about, you know, perhaps we need to provide more examples. And I take that criticism as well. I think raising the point is our main concern in this paper, since it is often disregarded. But providing perhaps examples on opportunities for instance, for the informal economy to come in would be interesting, and also for agriculture and so on. So thanks very much for those comments. And I think I will stop there for now, and I will leave others to comment.
Well, if I could just respond, I guess, on two quick topics. One is the suggestion for additional use cases, additional examples to build on what Erica was just talking about, and the second related to the overarching goals of this paper. So on the first point, I think you're absolutely right. We highlighted a couple of use cases, agriculture in particular. And the example of investments by IBM and John Deere into smart tractors and their deployment in the Nigerian context in particular is a good example of where we see this risk of data colonization because of a lack of either ownership of the underlying technologies or the ability to access or use the insights that they produce. And like Erica said, you know, in the African continent as a whole, or at least sub-Saharan Africa, we have over 50% of the labor force employed in agriculture. In some countries, it's as high as 70%. So that context is very, very different. Nagla, in the section of the paper that she drove on gender equality and inclusion and empowerment of women and girls, she highlighted this issue of data blindness. Which relates to the informal sector as a whole, not just in language processing, but in informal economic activity, and the differential impact that data blindness has in respect of women in many particular sectors of the informal sector, subsectors of the informal sector. So I think what we're going to do after this is really go back into the paper and reflect on how we can pull out some more of those use cases and concrete examples to strengthen the analysis and to really drive it home. The second point that I wanted to make is just on the goal of the paper, and I'm really glad actually hearing you describe the paper made me feel really good that we have achieved our objective actually, which was to work toward integrating African perspectives and priorities into these international debates and in the international discourse. And I guess I'll just end with a little story or anecdote here. Our goal in submitting this paper for We Robot 2020, the desire to do that stemmed from a conversation that we had, that I had with our dear friend Ian Kerr 2 or 3 years ago, when we were asking for referrals and connections to members of the We Robot community, which had then been established for almost a decade, of people who are really looking at this from perspectives of the global South and Africa in particular. And at that time, when we came up empty-handed, and we thought to ourselves, well, if Ian can't refer us to somebody who's dealing with these issues, that's a real gap and a real blind spot. So I think our main objective in writing this paper and submitting it for this particular conference was just to work toward what Ian had worked for his whole life, which was to grow the community of people and to make the community of people talking about these issues more inclusive, to bring these perspectives into this community as a means of putting this on the international agenda. And hearing you describe the paper, it made me feel like I think that objective has been achieved, and this is really a great starting point, like Arthur said, a great point to launch off from.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I think you've done very important work, and I'm eager to read the follow-up and the future set of articles that will be coming out of your work. So good job.
Fantastic. All right, so we have to leave it there for today, I think. A lot of really fabulous commentary here and a lot more to dig into in the comments below or on Twitter. And we hope to hear from all the folks in our broader We Robot community about the importance of incorporating these issues to the AI agenda. So thank you all very much for your participation. We really appreciate it.